The previous basket is under review.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Basket Under Review podcast. I am your host, Eamon Brennan of Buzzer at eamonbrennan.com. That's my newsletter. Go check it out. Also, check out Basket Under Review, the best new college basketball website in the world. We have a great guest here today. His name is Evan Miyakawa of evanmia.com. That's his statistics, analytics, college basketball obsessed website that has informed my work, made me smarter about college basketball, made a lot of other people smarter about college basketball, has also started making coaches and GMs smarter about college basketball. So we're going to talk about Evan's origins, how he got into this, and the sort of gradual uptake of his understanding of what his model says about players and team quality, and how it is impacting the college basketball landscape. We're also going to talk to him about his take on the season to come. We are mercifully very close to the start of the college basketball season. I'm very excited, and now is a really good time. We've previewed every conference in marathon podcasts. We've dug into the details and mid-majors and everybody that we think is going to be relevant this season on this show. And so now's a good time to just sort of get a lay of the land from Evan, things his model's surfacing that maybe cut against or reinforce some of the consensus that we've kind of come to in the past few weeks and months as a sort of college basketball media sphere. So it's going to be a great conversation. Before we get to Evan, I do want to remind you all to go to basketunderreview.com. Check out the website. $10 a month, you get access to the 3, 4, 5 really well-written, smart, analytical pieces that go up on the site every single day. You also get access to Trilly Donovan's Discord, where he breaks news and where there's a ton of really vibrant communities just talking college basketball 24/7, like real sickos in there. It's super fun, especially now that the exhibitions and stuff have been happening and people have been, firing off the sort of classic Discord-y hot takes. It's been enjoyable to chop it up in there with those folks. You also support this show and all of the other free stuff that we put out. Scout Team with Eric Fawcett and Kevin Sweeney, Stats with Will and Jim, Weekend Under Review, which is going to be twice a week and is going to be a great show, particularly now that the season's getting started and we have basketball to talk about. So go to the site, check it all out, support this show, and support everything Basket Under Review is doing. Also, please go support our sponsor, Homefield. HomefieldApparel.com is the presenting sponsor of this podcast. We're super proud about that because it's a great brand that we all buy stuff from. It has really elevated college athletics apparel from what it used to be when I was in college, which was going to buy my cheap little $10 t-shirt at the local, chain store. Homefield stuff is high quality. It looks awesome, feels awesome. And so it's been really great to have Homefield sponsor the show. We're very grateful to them. Please go check them out. Tell them we sent you. Again, thank you to Homefield for sponsoring our show. Okay, Evan, that's my intro. I'm done. We're in the podcast now. How have you been, man? It's good to see you.
It's been a great off season, and it feels like it's flown by. All of a sudden, you pull your head up above the sand, and the season's basically almost here. So I cannot wait, and there's a lot to get into for sure.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like in August and September, you're like, oh God, like how can this still be the off season? I cannot do this much longer, even though you're starting to like get into preview mode a little bit and things are a little bit more real. As a person putting out a one-man newsletter as primarily my form of written content, those summer months can be a little tough sometimes where you're like, I don't even feel like my readers want to read about this summer. It's so far away. You get the draft and that's kind of fun. And you can take a look once the rosters get settled, but there's, it was not a particularly newsy off season either.
Sure.
Some grand scheme of things, tournament stuff or whatever, but yeah, it's really good to be back closer to the actual basketball being played. And again, the next time people hear this show next Tuesday will be in the season. So very exciting and great to have you on to sort of, like I said, get a big picture appraisal based on your work and your model and what you're seeing and thinking about as we kind of get into the season. But first, I just wanted to start with, sort of what I talk to almost every guest on this show about, which is how you got into this in the first place. Obviously, you did your PhD in statistics. I'm guessing you were a big basketball fan before you did that, but maybe not. Like, how did you decide at some point, I'm going to apply this very advanced degree and these skills that I've acquired to this sport that we love so much?
Yeah, well, for me, I think it starts with the sport side of things, because I grew up in Indianapolis, about 10 minutes from Hinkle Fieldhouse where Butler plays. So I grew up a big Butler fan. and just always loved college basketball in general. Loved just the chaotic and unpredictable nature of it, especially the tournament. And I think one of my sort of core memories for me growing up that really established college basketball as being like my sport was my dad and I were at Hingle Fieldhouse watching the semifinal game between Butler and Michigan State in the Final Four, which was taking place in Indianapolis. And Butler ended up winning that game. And then my dad and I drove downtown and found a pair of Michigan State fans who didn't want their tickets to the final. And so they sold it to us, and I got to go to that national championship game against Duke, where Gordon Hayward almost hit that half-court shot that, is one of the most famous shots in college basketball history, if not sports history. And so obviously that was crushing, but a very cool moment for me as a, growing up, that really just established my love for college basketball. So obviously growing up in Indiana made me very basketball centric. And I think in general, the way I grew up, I've always been very sort of very analytical, very loved math growing up. Both my parents like worked in or had degrees in math or stats and things like that. And so I think from an early age, I started trying to like apply math to sports because I consumed so much sports and trying to measure things and quantify randomness and stuff. And so I ended up going on to get my undergraduate degree in mathematics from Taylor University in Indiana, where they have the Silent Night tradition, and then got my PhD in statistics from Baylor. So while I was in school, I started basically applying some of the stuff that I was learning in school kind of in my free time to college basketball, starting to tinker with some of my own rankings and algorithms like that, and basically created my website just kind of initially as a fun side project, just to sort of like get my feet wet with a few different skills, building statistical models, doing a little bit of like web design and things like that. Just kind of for the sake of getting some feedback on stuff I was doing. Didn't really have any plans for it to turn into anything serious, but because I really cared about it and just started putting stuff out there, people started noticing, and it just sort of organically grew, where all of a sudden I started getting contacted by coaches who were trying to use it. And it ended up landing me a job working for a sports analytics company that works with professional teams across all of the major sports. So I specifically worked with our NBA group, where we worked with basically 5 different front offices and research and development staffs at different NBA teams, doing some very sophisticated kind of groundbreaking statistical research for them. All the while, my site was growing on the side, and basically it kind of reached a point about a year and a half ago where it suddenly just kind of became viable for me to do the full college basketball side of things full time if I wanted. And so my wife and I prayed about it, and I decided like, this is really what I care about the most, and I just want to sink my full teeth into this. And so I've been doing my website full time for a bit of like a year and a half now, which has been really awesome. So that's just been a huge blessing from the Lord that I get to do that. And so it's used by a lot of coaches. There's over 100 different teams who are subscribed to my website in some form or fashion and use it for things like, recruiting, transfer portal analysis, game scouting, lineup optimization, things like that. But it's also widely used by fans and by people in the media like yourself. And so it really covers a lot of different bases. And I kind of like operating in that middle space between like the private consulting side with the coaches and also the very like public content side with everything I do in social media and online and stuff like that.
Right. Yeah. We had interacted numerous times before this, but the first time we actually met was this past spring at the Final Four. And you had mentioned you were there kind of, meeting with coaches, talking to staff, just kind of doing some of the Final Four thing that, coaches will go do. Like their teams aren't playing, but there's just always a gazillion coaches at the Final Four there because it's like their annual conference. And I was like, oh, that's, I hadn't really thought about that. I thought you were just kind of, not hanging out, but like you're there for the Final Four for obvious other sort of more mainline reasons. But that gave me a big hint that this was the thing that you're leaning into now, with being more one-to-one with staffs and helping them gain insights into how good players really are. Because I think, look, having just gone through previewing podcasts and also on my newsletter previewing every major conference, and I've got one more mid-major preview that I need to get out the door before the season starts in a few days here. But it is really hard, and I can totally understand coaches who would want more insight into what a model makes of players, and not just on the offensive end, but also on the defensive end, which is much harder to quantify, even with sort of your, more mainstream advanced analytics, your adjusted efficiency and offensive rating and so on and so forth, like what you get at KenPom. Traditionally, I mean, there are moments and events stats there, right? There's steals rate, there's rebounding rate, there's fouls called per 40 minutes, stuff like that. But your rankings, I think, have taken that to another, or your model, has taken that to another level in terms of trying to quantify defensive performance in the way that's always been super challenging. Is a player in the right position? Is his team better at defense when he's on the floor? And so, going through all of these rosters and trying to figure that out, it is really, really hard, even if you're super dialed into this stuff or try to be. And so I can imagine coaches like getting out there in the portal and they've got maybe 50, 60 kids they're thinking about offering in the course of 3 or 4 weeks in the spring, having the way I use fantasy football rankings from people that I trust to just take the work out of my hands and I'll just listen to you guys, is really super interesting. So tell me how that's developed a little bit and what you've heard from coaches about what they see in the model, how it interacts with their understanding of players, and kind of what they gain from it and what they are, looking for when they're trying to do what I think is as I talked to with Virginia coach Ryan Odom a few weeks back, what I think is still sort of a monumentally impressive thing. If you can build a good roster in 3-4 weeks or whatever, that's pretty incredible considering the context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think from a high level, what I'm trying to accomplish is a lot of what I do on my website goes through this player value metric I've created called Bayesian performance rating, which I believe is the best kind of all-in-one metric in college basketball in terms of measuring the value or impact that a player brings to their team while they're on the court, and kind of adjusting across all of Division I to kind of have everyone on the same scale. And basically what goes into that is there's several key factors. One is your individual kind of statistics and advanced stats, things like shooting efficiency, rebounding, assist, turnovers, that type of thing is pretty obvious. But the second thing that I also equally lean in on, and I think is very important to not forget, is outside of whether you score 30 points per game or 3 points per game, are you having a positive impact on your team's performance while you're on the court? Are good things happening? Is you being on the court leading to winning basketball on both ends? And so a lot of what I do also measures kind of that intangible stuff that you can't quantify just through the box scores or through the play-by-play data. And then there's also very much everything I do is predictive. So it's not just saying, here's how good this player has been this season. It's saying, here's how good this player is going to be going forward. And so it also accounts for what is your career history in terms of how productive or impactful you've been. What is your recruiting profile coming out of high school? And what does that say about you in terms of the level of impact or potential that you haven't reached in college? And all of that goes into during the season and during the off season, basically predicting offensively and defensively on a per possession basis how valuable these players are going to be. Now, with that being said, like I have an algorithm I essentially apply to everybody that's been statistically tested and validated over the years to make it as accurate as possible. But as we know, basketball is not just played on paper, and every single coaching staff has different things that they value or different schemes that they run that might highlight certain things or say, this player would be good somewhere else, but not here, or vice versa. And I cannot properly have all of that context. And so, there are certainly situations where a coaching staff might see a player I have rated, more poorly, and they might be like, well, I can see that, but for us, he's going to be a great player. And more often than not, they're probably right. And I think ultimately my approach with all of this stuff in interacting with coaches is saying, hey, you can't just trust the data blindly and say, this is what this says, therefore this is true, and I'm going to throw out any of my own kind of input or expert knowledge on this. But equally, you can't just disregard the data and the analytics, because they're able to make you smarter and get closer to the truth. They can help validate your own opinions. They can help show where you might be a little bit off and should consider other things. And your most informed position is when you combine your own expert knowledge in the subject in terms of your coaching and your understanding of basketball with these objective, unbiased tools that measure these things, and you put them together, and that's going to get you the closest to the solution. ultimately, I think what has really spoken the most to me about why this is so useful is having coaches come to me and basically say, hey, last year I kind of disregarded the analytics, disregarded certain numbers I saw on your site. And then the season played out and we stunk, or this player stunk. And I realized that, I should have paid more attention to it. And so this year, I'm not just blindly trusting the numbers, but I am going to kind of use them as a baseline of saying, like, every player that we recruit is going to be above this level of projected BPR, or, we're only going to look for players who are above this certain like 3-point shooting skill grade on your site or something like that. And I think that really helps you narrow down the field of like, hey, we might in the portal be trying to recruit a small forward, and basically I can use the data to whittle that list down to like 5 or 6 players who are all going to be of a certain quality, and then we can decide which one fits us specifically. But that's a lot better than just blindly shooting in the dark, just going based off film or something. And so a lot of coaches who have kind of embraced that as even just kind of a filtering mechanism for recruiting, or even during the season, kind of a like, hey, let's lean into the lineups that are doing better, or kind of pay attention to the lineups that your analytics are saying doing worse, and maybe just kind of keeping tabs on that during the season, and then trying to, adjust what we're doing going forward. Like, those things are really helpful, even if they're at the end of the day, not just like the end all be all, if that makes sense.
Right. For sure. I mean, this is always the discussion is, or at least it used to be a long time ago, of like, oh, the baseball nerds are ruining the sport with their numbers. And maybe in that case, the numbers are so pervasive now, you can sort of understand people's gripe a little bit. But you have this in like European soccer all the time, where there's all these new sort of metrics and understanding of how teams play and where they play. And you get old school fans still being like, I don't trust this, or you can't trust it. Like sort of what you were talking about building a metrics baseline for recruiting, right? And then you go to the tape. Then you figure out like, this guy stylistically actually doesn't work, even though he put up good numbers, or this guy's numbers weren't amazing, and his BPR doesn't look super attractive. But if you actually look at what they're doing stylistically, he wasn't asked to do a bunch of high value stuff that might kick up in the metric or whatever. Or the team was just bad and we like this guy and we think he can make a positive impact. It's interesting. So this past off season, you created a new tool called the Front Office Suite, which is exclusively available to teams, GMs, ADs, and coaches for putting together transfer portal teams, and that actually includes an estimate of NIL value. And so I'm curious how you generate that estimate, how you get a feel for the market more broadly, and how you've seen some coaches and GMs start to use that as a way to sort of track and analyze what they're trying to do, again, in a complicated and very rushed timeline. These are not multi-year evaluations, although they may be to some extent. Coaches have guys they keep an eye on. But in the transfer portal, particularly when you are a new head coach and your roster is entirely gone and you got to build a brand new team, this is something that you need to use and like actualize really quickly. So sort of how's that gone so far, and what have you seen from sort of the way coaches and GMs are using it?
Yeah, I think this was one of the first questions I started getting once NIL became a thing, of coaches was like, hey, I love your transfer portal rankings, but like, can you turn that into a dollar amount? And obviously that's not a trivial task at all. And the main challenge is, besides just getting a number for every player, is actually being able to account for where the market is at, right? And so basically what I'm doing kind of in a nutshell is I've done a lot of kind of building multiple models that essentially can translate your predicted player value from my transfer portal projections into basically relative to your roster, how much value you are adding, and that kind of being a sort of rough measure of your what percentage of a team's salary should be going to a certain player based on the value that they're predicted to add or something like that. And then there's an adjustment for, okay, well then where does this slot in compared to all the rest of Division One? Basically what you end up with is a relative dollar number of saying, if you compare one player to another player, you can figure out how much more percent one player should be worth to another. So for example, this guy should be worth 25% more than this other guy. And then basically what happens is every single team who uses the tool actually goes in and they enter in data points that represents where they believe the current market is at in terms of what players are either getting or are asking for in the market. So you would say like, hey, we are re-recruiting these 3 guys from our roster currently, and we're going to probably pay them these amounts, and you put in those amounts. You can say like, I heard this guy publicly went for this amount, this other guy recruiting is asking for this. And you basically put in as many data points as possible that represents right now currently where you believe like the going rate for some of these players are. And then basically what that does is it allows you to react to the market and specifically the kinds of players that you're recruiting or kind of are in your sphere. And then my model takes those and says, if this player is worth this and this player is worth this, and this is how much like where the whole market should be at and how much every single player should be at. And so it allows for you to be responsive to the market, because even what we saw this offseason, going rates for players like a week before the Final Four was very different from how it was, in mid-May or mid-June. And so you can actually kind of be reactive to what's going on there and use your own intel to basically inform my model, essentially, of saying like, here's how everyone should be ranked. Now, I don't like share any of those data points amongst the teams. It's all based on your own intel. It stays specific to you. But it's become a really, really valuable tool very quickly for a lot of high major and mid-major programs, because basically what it does is not only does it then basically give you an NIL estimate for every single player in terms of what roughly based on their predicted production for any team they were to play for, what they should be worth in this current market, but it also kind of gives you a range, like a lower and upper estimate of like, here's a reasonable range of how much this player should be worth. So if my estimate says he's worth 1.5 million, maybe the range is 1.1 to 1.9 or something. That feels pretty wide, but the reality is that, especially in this last offseason, there were just some crazy numbers going around for players, and it was pretty difficult for teams to really have a like ballpark of, based on where the market is at, is this a reasonable ask for this guy or not? And so when you're actually able to then compare it to what my own models say like this player should be worth, even if it's not exactly on the money, it tells you like, hey, are we in a reasonable range or not? And so you might have an estimate for a guy where my model says he's worth 1 million in this current market, and his agent is asking for 2.5 million. That's an immediate like, we probably shouldn't be looking at this player. Like we can get 2 players for that same amount of money who are just as good as this one guy based on what Evan's data is telling us. And so obviously like there's a lot of other things that go into how much you decide to play players, but in general, there is so much inefficiency in the market in terms of because of how quickly it moves and how much, players and agents are trying to capitalize on certain things, or vice versa. Coaches like putting a player in a situation saying like, hey, it's this offer or walk. Having a like rough baseline for how much these players should actually be worth, again, reacting to the current market, is extremely valuable. And so the teams that hopped on and used that when I launched it this offseason are already really profiting. And I've seen, just them not making crazy decisions in terms of where, what players should be paid, relatively speaking. So I think a lot of people are getting a lot of value into it. There's other stuff that goes into the tool as well, but the NIL part is certainly the main piece there.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're talking about it hints at how opaque everything is. It's all rumor, or, hey, I heard this guy's getting this. You kind of hear through the grapevine, and media members kind of hear through the grapevine, oh, it's this number. But there have been plenty of instances in the past couple of years where people have come out and said, no, that's not actually, it's not that much, or it's more than that, or whatever. And so coaches and staffs and GMs and ADs are operating from such an opaque baseline that even having let's throw in what we're hearing about what a player or what we're offering or what an agent has told us he has an offer for somewhere else, and then build out from there is really interesting. Have you, you mentioned teams. It doesn't have to be your clients. You don't have to talk your book, so to speak, but are there teams that you look at out there in college basketball that you see as having worked the portal in a financially efficient way this year? And, what does that look like? What do those rosters look like to you?
Right. I think that in general, because I can't actually know like what these teams are paying their players or paying for their rosters. You know, you could say, oh, this team's roster looks really efficient, but then it's if they spent 7 million on their roster versus 14 million, there's a big difference in terms of did they use that money well or not. So there's only so much like objective measuring we can do here, but I think based on public rumors and things like that, we can kind of get a decent guess at some of these things. And there are a couple teams like kind of at the top of the list. A team that sticks out to me that did a really good job with this was Michigan. I think Michigan was very smart in, obviously they got a lot of really good high level players through the portal. But I think that relatively speaking, the players that we know that they spent big money on, I think also rate really well in terms of the underlying metrics that point to them being successful. And I think part of what being smart with your portal decisions and how you allocate money is often about is sometimes being smart with how much you spend on, say, 3 to 4 players, then allows you to have the budget to then get the really big one. So I know that, Yaxel Lendeborg is going to be the player that is the most highlight grabbing player on their team that they got. And I think whatever they spent on him was probably worth it because I have him rated very highly. I think a lot of other people think he's going to be a real success for them. But part of why they were able to afford him was probably also because they didn't massively overspend on some of the other players that they got. And that's why their roster looks so strong right now. I have them, had them as the number 1 rated transfer class in the country. I think I have them going into the year ranked 6th with the second best roster in the entire country in terms of just the talent that they have on paper. And so I think they're a good example. I think another example is a team like Iowa. A lot of these teams who are having a completely different roster with a new coach, they can sometimes struggle. Obviously, there is a bit of a baked in nice factor of players coming with their coach from the previous school in Drake. And so they get kind of like family discounts essentially on some of those players. But from what I know about what they or have quoted to have spent on their roster compared to how much each of those players should have been worth in the open market, they might have spent maybe half of what they could have to buy that roster based on how valuable those players were. And so, I think they were one of the smartest spends. Again, they had a bit of an advantage because of the following their head coach. But even some of the other players they got to fill in their roster, I think were really smart gets too. And generally most, if not all of them they probably every single player that they paid more or less could have gone for a lot more based on what my projection showed for those players. And so again, you could have a single player or two where that projection is off, but when you add that up across a whole roster, generally speaking, it's gonna, if you're being really efficient in that way, it's gonna really prove dividends in terms of the actual result you're gonna get on the court.
Yeah, it's nice to get Bennett Sturts without a full open market bidding process because he's one of the best handful of guards in the country and didn't ever seem like it was ever a possibility for him to go anywhere other than play for Ben McCollum, guy who has turned him into one of the best players in the country. Okay, so let's sort of talk about a little bit about other things that we've kind of gotten into it already, but other things that your model surfaced that you maybe cut across or thought were stood out to you relative to the preseason consensus, which I think has early on, there are not very many people, in the summer and early fall, there are not that many people previewing college basketball, right? So it's a little bit harder to get a read on what everybody thinks. And then, Ken Pom comes out with his rankings and, really Bart Torvik, bless him, is the one with the earliest metric rankings that he puts out sort of as the portal is going along. I mean, his stuff is out in the, midsummer stuff and is helpful just for me, like rosters. I just need to know who's on what team, and Bart replacing 15-year-old websites tracking that stuff has been massively helpful for me. But now we're kind of, obviously we're a week away from the season. We're kind of getting, I was looking at doing my Big 12 preview, which is coming out, and looking at the, I was about to write a thing about how I thought Oklahoma State seemed like they were a little underrated by humans because of some of the personnel, both uses of the phrase there, guys that they have who are super talented, but human writers might be a little skittish on, but that the models look at and are like, oof, these guys are good and high volume and really solid. But they're ranked about where I thought they should be by the Big 12 media. So the metrics kind of informed human opinion now, and I think a lot of media members just kind of say, okay, well, Ken Pom says they're this, so that's probably where they are. But what are some things that stuck out to you as you kind of, released your rankings? You've obviously released, your base case and ceiling case for teams. What are some things that have stuck out to you as you've gotten the rankings out relative to sort of what you see in the sort of human consensus landscape?
Well, I think your point about the analytics informing the human opinions more and more, I think is true. And I think that's just the reality of people realizing, by and large, using this stuff is useful. And, certainly shouldn't just take it blindly, but it by and large does end up being pretty close to the truth. And I think
not to cut across you, it is a transition from a lot of these media members using Blue Ribbon and other similar magazines,
sure,
which come out in the summer or whatever, to now looking at, preseason, metrics, projections that have a lot of analytic substance to them.
Yeah, and I think maybe one of the funniest examples to me of, this could be slightly coincidence, but I think it's certainly related, is I released my preseason team and player ratings a bit earlier this year than I have in the past. I think I did it early September. And then Ken Pom did his human poll and released the results of that, a few days before his real rankings came out. And the human poll, as it works, is you have people go in, you basically say like who would win this hypothetical matchup, and then he tabulates that using an algorithm to say here's how basically all of these, college basketball sickos ranked all these teams. And the top 5 was the exact top 5 in the same order that my preseason rankings are. And I'm not sure that not every person doing that had my rankings pulled up when they were doing that, but I know that some did for sure. And so I think that, the reality is, I think we're getting smarter takes in the preseason because of using analytics. But with that being said, I think that there's always going to be certain kinds of players, certain kinds of teams that are often maybe overemphasized by the humans in the preseason. I think a lot of those teams end up being teams that have players that have really high potential. So, for example, teams that are very freshman reliant, that have, really big 5-star freshmen or really exciting international recruits, often can, maybe for good reason, be really hyped in the preseason and get a lot of love. And the reality is that in a lot of my research and how I form my preseason projections for freshmen is I basically look at, for every single player, amongst other things, roughly what is their recruiting profile coming out of high school? How do all of these consensus recruiting services rank them? And then looking at similar freshman recruits in college over the last 10, 15 years and saying, how did guys with a similar profile, a similar, stock essentially perform in their freshman year? And what I've often found is that, more often than not, there end up being some really good freshmen who end up being in the All-American conversation by the end of the year. But the reality is we don't know who it's going to be, because everyone thinks that their player on their team is going to be that guy. I've heard that level of hype around, not only the big 3 freshmen this year in Darren Peterson, Aja Debansa, Cam Boozer, but I've also heard about Mikkel Brown and Chris Sinak and a bunch of these other guys. And the reality is that like about half of them will end up being awesome and half of them will end up being like reliable pieces, but nowhere near the like elite players in the sport. And so because of that, a lot of the teams that are more freshman reliant, I might have a little bit lower in my rankings because the like average case for their players ends up being like good, but not fantastic, because the reality is there's just a lot of uncertainty attached to those players. And so those are interesting case studies for sure. Obviously I think the influx of international talent this year is kind of a similar conversation where
I was going to
a lot
ask
of people are
that.
really,
That was
really
going to be my
excited.
next question.
Yeah. A lot of people are really excited about these guys, and for good reason. We have almost no data, relatively speaking, on this number of, professionals or guys playing in the Euro leagues coming over to college. And so the way that I've sort of baked those in is I've been pretty conservative with those this year, where kind of a similar process, looking at how a lot of these recruiting services rank these guys and compare them to other incoming freshmen or transfers and their impact. And then roughly looking at how have guys with similar, profiles or being ranked similarly in previous years, how have they actually performed in college. But because we have such a small sample size, I've been pretty conservative with where I've put those projections. And so I think for a lot of these guys, they might be ranked a little bit lower nationally than people think. I'll have a more sophisticated process for that next year that will actually use a lot of their statistics that they have in comparing their competition level and things like that. But for this year, that was a bit of an interesting exercise. So I think in general, some of these teams that are hoping to get a lot of production out of their internationals, teams like Virginia, for example, maybe I won't have those guys ranked as highly as some people think that their production is going to be.
Yeah, that is the example in your rankings that sticks out to me, is Virginia being a bit lower than I think where other people are. But it has become a trend this year, and I have definitely done it, and I think for valid reasons of like, well, these guys played in the Adriatic League. That's like a real league. You know what I mean? Like that's a league with 30-year-olds that are good at basketball, and that play a style of play that I think adapts to college basketball in theory pretty well. Doesn't mean every single one of these guys, just because they played in the Adriatic League, is going to come over and be, a super plus college basketball player right away. Some will for sure, some may not. But I think it's interesting that you've like, that is another aspect to incorporate. You're going to have G League guys to incorporate next year, it sounds like, unless this changes in a meaningful way. And, I saw Kevin Sweeney tweeting as we were recording this on Monday night about a guy who actually played NBA Summer League and was not one of these G League guys who only just went to the G League and then is trying to come back to college basketball. But that's going to be another thing to figure out. But yeah, so players that are to you, is there a guy or guys that you think coming into this season look particularly underrated? And the guy who jumped out to me, and you already mentioned him, was Yaxel. But, everyone kind of thought he was going to be good. You have him as like way high in your player rankings, and you're super high on him. So that's maybe not the best example, but are there guys who you think people are maybe sleeping on a little bit that stick out to you of your individual player rankings have them as potentially elite?
Yeah, I think some of the guys that I think are the most interesting to talk about are guys that the current narrative is against them. Whether that's the success of their team last year, or certain high profile games that they were in that they performed poorly, or they were underperformers last year relative to expectation. And so the narrative is currently against them. But but people are really discounting their actual production, a lot of the stuff that ends up being really predictive of how one player is going to play in the next season. The main case for that for me is I love Bruce Thornton for Ohio State coming into this year. I have him ranked as the 6th best player in the preseason. Obviously, that's going to be really, really bullish compared to where he's slotted nationally. But I think the narrative piece is a huge factor here. Ohio State missed the tournament last year. I think a lot of people had higher hopes for that team. And I think they were very disappointing in a lot of the close games that they played. And just generally speaking, people were kind of sick of them by the end of the year. And given that Bruce Thornton,
the coaching situation probably plays.
Oh, absolutely.
There's no baseline for the coach to know okay, yeah, they were a little disappointing, but we've seen this coach be successful at, whatever, North Texas and Lemoyne and whatever. It's just, right. It's a first full year head coach who was an interim head coach, and people don't have that baseline of trust.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very valid concern of saying hey, the short track record for John Diebler has not been great. And we haven't seen any, proof that that's going to change. And so until that changes, you sort of, just put that as a big, con in the Ohio State column. But, I think for a guy like Bruce Thornton, in terms of his skill set as a playmaker, as a scorer, as a leader, in terms of everything that he does, he has so many attributes that a lot of other teams would envy to have in their point guard. and he's elite in a lot of different areas, especially offensively. I think offensively, what he does both in terms of scoring and facilitating and creating offense for Ohio State is really underrated. And I think given the roster that they've put together and the fact that they have retained basically their three best players from last year who could return, along with getting some fresh talent. Again, like the coaching piece still needs to be answered. Like, is this coaching staff, is Diebler going to be a lot better in situations where he wasn't last year? But also a lot of times you have teams that for whatever reason, in a certain season, like the luck just isn't there and they lose a lot of games that they could have won. And you just flip the coin a little bit differently the next season and all of a sudden it starts falling their way. I think it was Gonzaga maybe last year who, Mark Few had a tremendous track record of winning all of these close games over his career. And then there's just a season where all of a sudden they go like 1-7 in games within like 2 possessions or something. So like that stuff can happen. And so, I don't overreact to that sort of thing. My model certainly doesn't. And so I think Bruce Thornton is going to be really good this year. Maybe another player who I don't have ranked in the top 10, but the narrative is against him is Alex Karaban for UConn. I think Karaban was hyped as being one of the best players in college basketball coming into the year last year. And then UConn obviously fell a bit flat last year, and Karaban was not the elite 3-point shooter that he was the season prior. But I think it's swung too far in the opposite direction. And I still think he's a very good player. I think he's going to come back to some of his previous form. And so a lot of these kind of narrative cases are the ones that are interesting to look at.
Yeah. Caravan's a great example. Again, 2 off seasons ago, I think I did a mailbag where people asked, if you had to put together a best 5 and pick a coach in college basketball. And I picked him because I was just like, look at this guy. Maybe he's not the single most talented player at this position in college basketball, but you can put him in almost any 5 in that like 3-4 hybrid, wing outside in type of role. And he's going to be super useful. And they just, they had a weird year last year. And I think they had a weird year. Dan Hurley has talked about this numerous times in the offseason where he was just like in a bad mental place and the team didn't really come together early in the campaign and their star freshman got injured and they just kind of took a while to figure out. But you go back and look at how they ended the season and how they played against Florida in the title game. And you saw all of the tactical X's and O's UConn stuff that has elevated them beyond just their talent in the past, 3 seasons. And you can see that playing out for Karaban again this year. So you also have lineup analysis in your model, which is again super useful. It's a really useful thing when you're writing about teams to understand which players on these teams actually play better instead of just the whole team is good or the whole team is bad. You can see combos of different guys, 2-3 guys that when they play together are really, really good. Do you have a few lineup combinations that stuck out to you when you were putting together your preseason stuff that are like, wow, keep these guys on the floor together as much as possible?
Yeah, basically one of the newer things on my site is that not only do I actually like measure how good these lineups perform, but I actually have projections for each lineup in terms of how good they're supposed to be going forward based on not just how that lineup has performed on the floor so far, but also the individual qualities that each of those players bring and the lineup composition, the overall chemistry and balance of that lineup. And so it's really helpful during the season because it helps you not overreact to small sample sizes. That's one of the big question marks about trusting lineup analysis is, okay, this lineup has looked great, but they've only played 25 possessions. That's like less than a half of basketball. Like, can we take anything from that? And oftentimes the answer is like maybe a little bit, but you certainly can't just like trust that blindly. And by the end of a season, like most teams only have maybe 5 or 6 lineups that they've played that over a full game of action. And so that's just not a lot of data to go by. So what my model does is it says like, hey, we'll learn from that somewhat, but we also can just like have a good guess at how this lineup should be, even if we hasn't played it all together. And so during the season, it kind of combines those two things to basically predict a team's or a lineup's efficiency offensively and defensively, and also rates how good it should be in all of these different skill areas. Like what's the lineup's predicted 3-point shooting percentage and free throw percentage and offensive rebounding rate and things like that. The fun thing is that I also can do this in the preseason for any lineup potentially that a team could roll out, or during the off season as you're putting a roster together, of saying, hypothetically, how would this lineup of 5 look? And so I don't have this up as of when we're speaking, but sometime in this week leading up to the season, I'm going to actually push the go button on actually having projections for every single team in terms of all the lineups that they could run and how good they might be. And you can even then sort by like, here is the projected best 3-point shooting lineup in the entire country going into the season. Here's the projected best rebounding lineup, etc. So in general, it's very interesting to look at some of the more interesting lineups that we'll see this season. Like, for example, the St. John's starting 5 of, who is the point guard on this team, and like, how do those lineups look potentially in terms of filling in what a point guard is supposed to do? Looking at Florida's starting lineup potentially, where you have Thomas Haug starting at the 3 and having like 3 big guys in there. That I think, from my calculations as of right now, I think Florida's starting lineup is supposed to be the best starting lineup in the entire country going into the year. And that does take into account the fact that you have this a bit of an unorthodox height thing going on. And because part of what my model does is it will actually dock your lineup for doing something like that's very much an outlier in a potentially negative way, like playing a lineup that's too tall or too small, or that has, too little 3-point shooting or something. It will actually penalize your lineup if it is like crazy in some of those regards. And even taking that into account, Florida's lineup is still supposed to be really good. So, a lot of different interesting use cases to look at there for sure.
Yeah, that's fascinating with Florida, because that is the big question about them going into the season, is like, is that a viable lineup, or is that what you would do if you were playing like 2K? You know what I mean? Where, yeah, just put all the best players on the floor and get them all on the floor together, versus does this actually work stylistically? Do the skills overlap too much? Is Hauk just fundamentally a college 4? And he's shot the ball well enough that you think he can space the floor a little bit. Maybe he will take another step in that direction, where the skills aren't as overlapping as you might think, and the benefits of all that height and size and rebounding from the 3 position are there. But it's really interesting because they have 4 with him, Chinyelu, Condon, and Hanglotten on the bench. They have that same 4 starting front court, and they just won a national title. And not all those guys are going to want to play a platoon of 4 for 2 spots, probably, you would assume, maybe particularly Hauk. So very interesting to figure out. One other interesting thing that you just started rolling out and talking about more commonly on social media and Twitter and stuff, is the ceiling and floor for teams. How is that calculated? And give us some teams that had the most disparity between, you run all these simulations and the top level ceiling result is the furthest away from the floor result. What are teams that stick out to you as being the most uncertain?
Basically, when I put my team projections together in the preseason, not only do I have an average predicted rating for each team in terms of their efficiency margin, essentially, but there is also a measurement of uncertainty that goes with each of those projections based on teams that we have a pretty good understanding of how good that team's going to be based on returning talent they have, returning coach, things like that. And teams that have a lot more uncertainty, teams that have either are more reliant on freshmen who have much wider range of outcomes in terms of how they could pan out, teams that are more reliant on transfers and just not knowing exactly how those are going to pan out, or teams with a new head coach. There are different factors that are part of the model that have more uncertainty that kind of come attached with that. And so basically I'm able to use these measurements of uncertainty to basically then simulate the season essentially like 10,000 times and say, based on all of these preseason projections with the uncertainty attached to each team, here's all the possible different scenarios of how like good or bad this team could end up being ranked nationally by the end of the season. And essentially I look at the teams that have the highest amount of variability across all of the potential like end of season ratings that they could have. And then I can kind of order those in terms of saying like, here is their like best case finish in terms of where they'll rank, and here's their worst case finish, and here are the teams that have the most uncertainty. And so looking at some of those teams in the top 50 that have the most uncertainty in this blog post that I put out, you have teams like Duke, who are very freshman reliant. I think the uncertainty there is partly because like the best case scenario is Duke could be the most talented team in the country. Worst case scenario is some of these freshmen, specifically like Cameron Boozer, might just be like good, but not great. Obviously, all the Duke fans think he's going to be great. But as we talked about earlier in this conversation, like there really is a lot of uncertainty with some of these freshmen. And so you don't actually know who's going to pan out. You have a team like Auburn, who, just had to change coaches last minute and basically has a team that's surrounding one key returning player in Tahad Pettiford, and then a bunch of other guys who are going to kind of basically form a new team around him. So there's a wide range of outcomes there. You have teams like Baylor who, have an entirely new roster. And so, some of these teams, there's just a lot wider of a disparity in terms of like the best case and worst case scenarios, just because there's a lot of variables that are kind of more unknowns for these teams.
Right. And it's interesting too that you mentioned that Auburn, because Bruce Pearl's departure affected your model, right? Like, how does coaching impact your model and its evaluation of teams? Because, I think that's baked into a lot of metrics, but actually quantifying it is both useful and super interesting. So like, what does the model feel like? What is it spitting back out to you? Like Bruce Pearl, established coach, years of success. Like how long does it quantify what he's done in college basketball versus a first-year head coach who might run the exact same stuff, but has no track record in the system, if that makes sense?
Yeah, essentially, the most important part in putting these preseason projections together, no matter what your coach situation is how talented is your roster. That's the most important part for sure. But outside of that, there really is a part to, if you have a team who's had the same head coach for multiple years, you can gain a lot more understanding about what's likely to happen for that team based on looking at the recent track record that team has under that head coach in terms of how have they performed in previous seasons? Have they outperformed or underperformed kind of the talent they have on their roster? And that can be a helpful indicator of how they're going to do this year. Example is Houston. On paper, my model only has Houston as having the 5th best roster in the entire country. But when you account for their head coach and the track record that they have, they come out as the number 1 team in the preseason because Kelvin Sampson has shown time and time again, especially over the last 5 years, that he's going to be in the top like 3 to 4 teams every single year. So he gets a lot of credit in the model that ends up going into that projection. When you look at a team like Auburn, you go from having Bruce Pearl with a very similar case of like he has been so stable and able to get great results out of his teams to all of a sudden he's gone. Now, his son, Steven, has been in the program, and it's not like you're getting a completely new head coach, but all of a sudden you're removing the Bruce Pearl variable. And so not only does that slightly bring down Auburn's ranking, I think they moved maybe down like 5 spots from like 20th to 25th for me, but also it increases the uncertainty related to their team because there's more of an unknown about like how is the coaching aspect going to work out for them this year. And so, it's very interesting to sort of see how those teams look. And I think it's specifically for teams with new head coaches where there is oftentimes the most uncertainty, because it mostly just comes down to how good is your roster. And then like, we'll see how the rest pans out.
Is that kind of what you saw with Kansas, in that it's Bill Self and it's Kansas and there's this super long track record in the last, 20 years, obviously. I'm not sure if your model takes that into account, but even the last 5, right? Kansas did win a national title in the last 5 seasons. And so for as sort of middling by their own standards, the last couple of years you're still a little bit higher on Kansas than I think the sort of zeitgeist consensus is. Is that a big part of it? Because roster wise, obviously they have Peterson. He looks really good. Exhibitions, which we're going to talk about in a second, he's played well in, and everybody who's been around that program, who's seen him play in the summer, thinks, oh yeah, he's actually as good as people are saying. But again, with freshmen, sometimes you don't know. And the rest of the roster is Flory Badunga and some guys that are not Kansas's typical level. And it's, they were very active in the portal and didn't land a couple of the top guys that they were trying to get. So you can understand why people are a little bit down on them.
Sure.
Sans Peterson this year. But is that kind of why they're where they are?
Well, I mean,
which they're not super high. They're 19th, but that's still a little higher than the consensus, I guess.
I feel like I've seen that's kind of in somewhere in the mid to late teens is where I've seen Kansas slotted. I feel like that seems, at least from my analysis. But I think if you were taking this exact Kansas squad, but you were using the coaching variable 3 years ago for Kansas, I think this team would be more slotted like a borderline top 10 team, probably.
Okay.
Because recent years do get more weight in my algorithm where it's not equally weighting Bill Self's whole career, especially in the changing landscape of college basketball. How a coach has done in the last year to two matters a lot more than how they did 6 to 7 years ago. And so you've had a couple cases in a row where Kansas has had a really good roster on paper and then has been kind of underwhelming. I did not have Kansas ranked number 1 in the preseason last year like they were in the AP poll. I think I had them more like 6th or 7th, but still they ended up being disappointing relative to that. And so, that does go into my algorithm of saying like, hey, if you would put this Kansas roster and slapped it in 2021, like the coaching variable for Bill Self would be a lot more positive than it is now. And so, I think, I think they need to, it's not a huge negative factor in Kansas's column, but there needs to be some return to form of showing that he's going to extract as much out of this collection of talent that he has as possible.
Yeah. Interesting times at Kansas. Okay. One more thing before I want to ask you about exhibitions and whether or not I should care about them. You posted about 3-point shooting regression, which is really interesting. Basically, I'm just going to read it out. Last year, there were 174 players who returned to college basketball who shot at least 40% from three. The year prior, your baseline is a minimum 40 attempts. Only 17% of them shot above 40% again the next year. Just 7% matched or improved their percentage the previous season. So is that just, minimum 40 attempts, you could maybe say that's kind of small sample size. Some of the guys that you have at the top of this list who did not regress, like Kobe Brea, LJ Cryer, Isaac McNeely, I think everyone would class as among the best 3-point shooters in college basketball last season. How much of this is luck? How much of this is just situation? What do you make of that stat? Because I think there's such an emphasis in the portal these days on 3-point shooting. It is such a sought after trait, right? And maybe some of these guys that are getting brought in, it's like, oh, he shot 42% from three last year on like 112 attempts. So he's a legit 3-point shooter. I think of a guy, at Indiana, like Lamar Wilkerson, that's a big hope for them, is that he's going to carry over that level of shooting. It just doesn't happen for a lot of these guys in the same way.
Yeah, I do think a lot of it is luck. And I don't even say like they got lucky to shoot over 40%, but that is hard to sustain a percentage above 40% for that long across the course of your career. Basically, one of the things that I've done on my site to really address this problem is I mentioned this before, but I have these player skill projections for every single player. So for example, every single player in Division I has a projection for what their 3-point shooting percentage is going to be going forward versus an average Division I opponent. And basically what that does is it looks at their entire game-by-game history of how they've shot the three, looking at who they've played, the level of opponent, the offensive role, the usage, and adjusting for all that stuff, and then saying like, based on all this data that we have, here's how a player like this would typically shoot in their, like going forward in terms of their percentage. And so when you look at when you sort my like leaderboard by the top projected 3-point shooters this year, you have Isaac McNeely at the top at 41.7%. There's only 6 guys in Division I who are predicted to shoot over 40%. Now, there are going to be way more than 6 players who shoot over 40%, but that's not the point. The point is that if we're trying to take a best guess at what all of these good 3-point shooters are going to shoot, a vast majority of them, even who shot above 40 last year, will regress kind of towards the Division I average this year. And that's like totally fine. Like a consistently great 3-point shooting percentage is one that's even just in the 37 to 38%. If you can do that consistently across the course of your career, you are a very, very good college 3-point shooter. We talked about Alex Caravan earlier, where, his big attribute coming into last year was, look at how elite this guy is from 3-point. Right. And then he only shot, more like mid 30s last year. Well, part of what my model does is it doesn't overreact positively or negatively to what a player did. It kind of figures out the right amount of weight to apply to your more recent games, but then also not just discounting your whole career. And so for a guy like Caravan, his predicted 3-point percentage for this year is 37.6%, which would be a couple percentage points better than what he shot last year, a couple percentage points worse than what he shot the year before. But on aggregate, that's roughly the level of 3-point shooter he's shown himself to be. So basically, my main point with a lot of this stuff is a lot of people just expect that whatever a player shot last year from 3, especially if it was an excellent percentage, is just going to be sticky and be the same this year. And the reality is it won't, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like if you have a guy who shot 43% last year and then he only shoots 37%, that's still like better than what you could expect from most of the players in college.
Right. Yeah. You take 37% from 3, particularly on high volume any day of the week. And that's a super valuable skill set that people are paying a lot of money for in college basketball. Okay. So I think I maybe know the answer to this question, but should I care about exhibitions at all? I care about the performances. I like watching guys play, right? And it was a fun weekend this past weekend for exhibitions. You had Purdue, Kentucky, Duke played Tennessee, Kansas played Louisville, Carolina played BYU. You had Michigan, St. John's, all fun, interesting games. But I feel like there is a bit now, because these exhibitions are relatively new in college basketball, there's a bit of overreaction theater that's happening already. Not just to the results, but sometimes also to the performances, like the Kentucky Purdue game. Just sort of like, all right, chill out. Purdue is still good. Like, it's okay. What do you make of that? Obviously, I don't think it's going to like go in your model, but do you sit there and watch an exhibition game and think, ooh, maybe I need to reevaluate, or maybe the model is wrong about this? Like, what do you make of the exhibition trend and kind of what the games say to you?
I mean, from a fan perspective, it's hard to not look at it and be excited about it, because it's the first like real-ish basketball that you've had to watch since April. And so for that perspective, like, it is going to be the biggest data point we have so far about what the season will look like. The problem is that once we hit day 1 of the season, it becomes almost instantly irrelevant, because the actual games that matter suddenly carry so much more weight. And I think, if a team plays great in an exhibition game and then they actually start the season 0-1, people are going to forget about the exhibition game. Now, I mean, in general, there are things we can learn about them from getting a better idea of how a team might play or the types of lineups that they might run or strategy. But the reality is that for an exhibition game, for any coaching staff, the point isn't just to win. The point is to like learn and figure out what you can do and try and experiment with things. The goal may not actually be to like have a better number in your score column than the other team. And there have been plenty of examples of exhibition games in previous years where people way overreacted to how a team played positively or negatively, and then they ended up it being nowhere near what happened during the season. So for me personally, I'm kind of a like largely stay away from exhibition games, just because I don't want them to inform my biases going into a year when I will just quickly actually have like real data coming from games that actually matter and count in your win-loss column. And that can make a huge difference in terms of how a coaching staff approaches a game and the types of things they do to actually win the ball game. And so, I mean, I remember seeing like mid-December last year that people were saying like, well, our team has been terrible, but I still saw good things in that exhibition game from the ex-opponent. And it's like, that does not matter at this point. It just does not. So I think they're fun.
That sounds like Arkansas.
Yes, exactly.
Last year, they beat Kansas in an exhibition game. It's like, wow, Arkansas is going to be really good. They got there eventually, but...
Well, 2 years ago, Arkansas beat Kentucky or Purdue in an exhibition game. And then Purdue ended up making the national title game, and Arkansas like didn't even come close to making the tournament. So,
right.
Again, like you can learn things, but I've seen some people like restructuring their preseason rankings based on some of these exhibition games from this weekend, and that is, for me, it's a bit too far.
Yeah, it seems like a bad idea. Again, it's fun and it is useful, I think, for seeing players like Caleb Wilson in North Carolina. Looks like he's
For
going to
sure.
be the real deal. You know, he looked really good the other night, and the way he's going to be utilized by Hubert Davis looks like that is going to make sense. You know, he's not just going to stand in the corner. He's going to have the ball in his hands a ton. All good things, right? You know, Debanza at Nebraska looked incredible in front of 14,000 people, which is, you know, I think a good indication of what the AJ Debanza experience is going to be like this year. But he also had some possessions where he looked completely lost defensively, and that might also be part of it, and would you know, dovetail with what BYU was last year defensively, which was not very good.
I mean, I remember last year there was an exhibition game where Con Knipple for Duke like shot like 300% from three, and everyone thought that he was going to, you know, break Reed Shepherd's freshman shooting like percentages, and he ended up being like a solid 3-point shooter, but not anywhere near one of the elite 3-point shooters in the country. But based on that one single exhibition, it just, because we're starved for stuff to talk about, you know, people drew way too much from that. So I just I take it a little bit more with a grain of salt at this point.
Well, good news for everybody is the season starts very soon. We are out of the off-season doldrums. The previews have mostly been written. I've got one more I got to get out. I will get it out the door on time. Evan, thank you. This was great. Please go check out Evan's site. It's evanmia.com. He has, again, like I said at the top of the show, really informed my work since his site launched in the early days. And it's been a pleasure watching sort of people, more and more people take on what he's using to analyze college basketball. And again, like I said at the beginning, I think some of the utility of what he's doing goes beyond some of the analytics that are out there, in that he's quantifying player performance on both ends of the floor in a way that not a lot of other people are doing. So if you want to figure out if a guy's actually good at defense without grinding tape for 4 hours of their sort of NEC games as a power forward or whatever, you've got a shortcut and a cheat code with Evan's stuff. So yeah, like I said, go check out Evan's work at evanmia.com. Evan, thank you for being on the show, man.
This was great. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm just really, really excited. We're so close to getting some real action here.
I know. It's very exciting. Good luck with all of your stuff in the future. We will be back next week with another show. Thank you to our producer, Corey Aldis. Thank you to our graphics guy, Sam Freyer. Thank you to everyone at Basket Under Review. Go check it out. Sign up, subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.